All right, everyone, welcome back to this special edition of the ACFCS Financial Crimecast, a video version. So, in the association's continuing series to engage top thought leaders in the FinCrime space on tips, trends, and tactics to improve immediate outcomes, we get a rare and special chance to view and preview compliance inflection points across institutions with one of the sector's biggest technology leaders through the lens of stronger laws in the United States and other countries shifting to focus more on effectiveness and results than process and procedures. Our guest in this discussion is Stephen Taylor, General Manager of Anti-Money Laundering at NICE Actimize. In our prior discussion, Stephen was kind enough to share vital insight on how countercrime teams were responding to the pandemic, including through stronger technology partnerships and what criminal trends were changing. Stephen, thank you so much for being with us here today. Tell us a little about yourself, what you do at NICE Actimize, and how you got into the field.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Brian. Glad to be here again. Glad to be talking with you again. Much appreciated. As you say, I'm the General Manager at NICE Actimize. I've been here for about 4 years now. Ultimately, my role is to ensure that we're providing the best AML solutions to meet, emerging regulatory and industry needs. I've worked within governance, risk and compliance for the last 20-25 years, and nice. Actimize is a great company, and I'm glad to be part of the organization.
Well, we are very glad to have you, Stephen. You have incredible knowledge to share, and I appreciate you being so gracious with your time. So a couple of things we want to cover today. So we're going to talk about effectiveness, but also some of the ways to reach that, exploring the consortium topic for increasing program and technology effectiveness, the changing nature and tenor of effectiveness. And there's a nuance here. So regulators are supposed to be more working alongside banks as they help law enforcement, but also, and this is a good nuance that Stephen mentioned to me, they're also going to be putting more force behind compliance. So more foot on the gas, while at the same time trying to foster more innovation, the effectiveness, the results. We also want to talk about some tips and tricks on being effective. This is kind of an esoteric idea of effectiveness, but there are some kind of bright line auditable boundaries to put on there to actually help you when you sit back down at your desk. And then also the global state of regulation and tips on managing these changes. And hopefully, if we have time, some kind of AML aftershocks of this latest massive leak, the Pandora Papers, which from ICIJ, the same group behind the Seminole Paradise Papers, Panama Papers, and then a little look ahead of kind of what's coming in the first 6 months of 2022. But first, a quick little bit of level setting. So today we're going to be discussing a potential glimpse of the future of financial crime, which many believe will have effective compliance teams generating highly useful and relevant intelligence to investigators in focused, shifting, defined priority areas, both broad generators of illicit income like corruption, cyber-enabled fraud, but also attuned to the actions and reactions of international threat actor groups. Now, those are just some of the takeaways from the U.S. Treasury's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network releasing its formal list of national anti-money laundering AML priorities, a collection of historic foils like organized criminal groups and other rising risks like record ransomware attacks and crypto-fueled paydays. Now, these widely watched and highly anticipated AML priorities are the first concrete update to implement the U.S. Anti-Money Laundering Act, the AMLA, the most significant upgrade to the country's FinCrime framework since the 2001 USA Patriot Act, which really is kind of the foundation of the entire industry we're in right now. So what is the AMLA? It's an expansive package of updates to break open beneficial ownership bastions, bolster public-private information sharing, and usher in a new era of innovation and focus on effectiveness with the threat of higher penalties for violations and serial scofflaws. Also, at the same time this was released, so we're all talking about effectiveness, but no one has really defined it. Well, the Wolfsburg group took a stab at that, and I think it's very rich, even though it's very short. So in short, the Wolfsburg metrics of effectiveness include: are you compliant with local AML laws, but cognizant of global standards? Again, this all comes from FATF and them pushing their country evaluations to effectiveness in 2013. So are you producing highly useful information to law enforcement guided by these national AML priorities? Also, do you have a reasonable compliance program? And Stephen's going to talk about that word reasonable Do you have a reasonable compliance program that reviews internal and external threats, gaps, and vulnerabilities and adjusts based on rising or receding risks and law enforcement input? So I guess I'll turn it over to you now, Stephen. There is a lot going on, and I know you're in the thick of this, but my question with all this going on, the Anti-Money Laundering Act, the AML priorities, the Wolfsburg Group, the tenets of this effectiveness, what are kind of banks, either should they be doing differently or what are they doing differently to kind of adjust to this new standard?
Yeah, sure. Well, look, there's an awful lot to unpack there. But let's start off with the AMLA 2020. The priorities came out at the end of June, beginning of July of this year. I think that they were highly anticipated by the industry in general. They knew that something was coming. They weren't quite sure what that is. And to be quite honest with you, I think it's still a little bit too early to tell exactly what this all means. The rulemaking should start at the end of this year, beginning of next year. I think that that's when we'll start seeing exactly what the regulators actually have in mind. But I think that as I look at the priorities, to be honest with you, there's not really that much that's new on the priorities. Right. I think that a lot of the things that FinCEN in particular are looking to put some focus on have been priorities for the last few years. So that's why I think it's going to be very interesting indeed to understand a little bit more about what specific requirements, what specific regulations are going to be introduced. But ultimately, it makes perfect sense. The regulators need to get more effective information. If you look at the AML world in general, we're not really being that effective. 2 trillion, I mean, these are often quoted numbers, but about 2 trillion is being laundered each and every year. We claw back about 1 to 2%. We know that there's about 40 million people in modern slavery. We know that about 75% of them are women and girls. Terrible, terrible stats, right? So we know that we have to be more effective, and we know that from the FinCEN leaks that happened last year, we know that there's an awful lot of information that gets sent to the regulatory agencies and to law enforcement. A lot of that information is not necessarily as effective or as useful or as insightful as anyone would wish for it to be. As a result, there's an awful lot of noise, and there's an awful lot of weeding through to actually find out where the true suspicion actually is. Well, so I'm not surprised that the regulatory agencies are trying to make things more effective. I'm also glad to see, and I've seen this within financial institutions, that they want to make their programs more effective, right? They understand that there's an awful lot of time and energy that's wasted potentially in filing structuring SAR, say, for instance. They want to make sure that they're doing their best to actually go after true crime and the real bad actors that are out there. So, I do see that there's a bit of a marriage here between the industry trying to do its part, the regulators trying to do its part as well. Hopefully we can get everything to join in the middle, but there's an awful lot of detail that still needs to be defined.
So the nuance when I was working on my story, because you're absolutely right. There's been a big kind of a wide berth of reactions to when these priorities came out. Some people said exactly what you said. They said, ho hum. These are things that banks are already kind of on the hook for. What is such a big deal about this? Where other people have said the complete opposite. They said, no, you guys are missing the point here. In so many of kind of what should banks do about this thing, these specific things, corruption, grand corruption, terror finance, these are kind of mentioned in great detail, but they're in these dense and didactic reports from government, the National Proliferation Finance Strategy, the National AML Risk Assessment. But now the nuance is they're pulled out front and center to say these are now program priorities. Now, to me, what is different from what you're already doing? And this is what I wrote in my story. So before, it used to be that doing your AML program, you're supposed to look for potential money laundering or terrorist financing, but the underlying crimes, the specific fraud, the human trafficking, the corruption, that was kind of like a nice to have, but you have to file on what you think are suspected money laundering. To me, this changes everything. When you put these priorities front and center, they go from kind of a nice to have to a need to have. Now it's a little more specific that, yeah, okay, you found this potentially strange thing happening in your bank, but what is the underlying crime? So to me, it seems to put a little bit more pressure on those kind of fulcrum points of where banks can do good in this. And that's exactly where you come in, the technology side, better data analysis, parsing these things out, but then also kind of the human training, so they know these red flags to look for to make better SARs, to better support, law enforcement. What's your take on that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that, look, there are some areas that are a little bit more, as it were, emerging. So for instance, crypto. 5 years ago, people wouldn't be necessarily talking about crypto regulation. And there's other things that I think that, to your point, have maybe been buried a little bit, but now have come out front and center, like human trafficking, right? And I think that that's something that's incredibly important to drive, within the industry as a whole. Look, at the end of the day, I think that the technology, right, is a big part of how the banks can become more effective. Clearly, there's policies and procedures and internal training and having the right staff. That's all a huge part of it. But from a technology perspective, I think that there's so much that's been developed over the course of the last 5 years in particular that we can now leverage to our advantage, right? So for instance, things like machine learning and AI. The more data you give machine learning AI, the more effective it actually becomes. It can really help identify true crime, the needle in the haystack, as it were. There's other elements that, again, are coming a little bit more to the fore. So for instance, the concept of entity resolution, the concept of network link analysis, network risk analysis, right? Where you can actually see the individual themselves, but you can then also understand, the connections, the hidden connections, the unknown connections between various different individuals or entities. These types of things, I think, can help dramatically improve the effectiveness of AML programs. Instead of getting 95% false positive rates, a lot of that can be reduced, considerably using these capabilities. And instead, what you're, getting to is identification of true crime, more readily, and then the people within the banks and within the financial crime units, they can actually work those alerts more effectively and identify true suspicious activity that can then go to law enforcement. It takes a lot of the burden off the industry. More importantly, it takes some burden off the regulators and potentially gives better insights to law enforcement.
Now, you had mentioned in our kind of practice chat on here, part of this as consortium-based learning. And I love talking about that because to me, that goes to kind of the heart of what the Anti-Money Laundering Act, one of the main things that it's trying to foster. So for a long time, these kind of like public-private partnerships or partnerships between banks, it was kind of like something that the leading banks would do because they're kind of leading the charge. Oh, sorry. Of course. They're kind of leading the work from home, everybody. Here we go. But you have the big banks that are doing these incredible either partnerships with other large banks to share information, to share kind of compliance tactics. But you go down to the smaller and medium banks, and that wasn't happening as readily. But to me, what it specifically spells out in the AMLA, more partnerships, either between banks and each other or between banks and law enforcement. And it seems like the consortium-based approach, that could really help everyone involved, because that's, multiple banks getting together to kind of, like you said, get better and richer data and see more of the pieces of the puzzle that would normally be scattered across multiple institutions and multiple jurisdictions. Tell me a little about that.
Yeah, no, I think that one of the biggest challenges is silo busting, right? So ultimately, that's within an organization, and then that's in the bigger framework. So within a bank itself, sometimes banks are structured very much, here's my KYC team, here's my transaction monitoring team, here's my fraud team, and ultimately, they probably don't even know one another, right? But ultimately, that richness of understanding between those teams is vital to identifying true crime. You've really got to understand your entity, you've got to understand how they're transacting, you've got to understand the insights from all of these different, as it were, control infrastructure pieces, to, as I say, pinpoint, where the bad actors could potentially be. So internal to an organization, there's some silo busting. But, criminals, in the external world, criminals aren't going to one bank and just using them to kind of do all their money laundering activities. It's not a one-stop shop at one institution, right? And, part of the challenge for, us as an industry as a whole is really following the flow of money through various different institutions as the money launderers or the criminals are using these institutions to, as it were, hide the cash or to actually just make the cash more legitimate for them to use. So, we have to find a better way of, finding the flow of money. And the banks, to a certain extent, have worked in collaboration to do some of this. There is some precedent in place, like 314B, where you can share information between the banks. Maybe under AMLA that becomes compulsory rather than voluntary. That might be something that actually happens. But I think that there's other ways in which you can actually now share data. First of all, there's technology that will allow us to do, apply machine learning across various different institutions and then get some kind of insights from that. So federated learning, say, for instance, is a non-invasive way of getting the insights for individual institutions without breaking any kind of data privacy requirements, finding what those insights are, and then the industry as a whole can benefit from those insights. That's one way of doing it. The other way of doing it is, we've seen some of the regulators really pushing now kind of anti-money laundering utility programs. In the Netherlands, there was one specifically.
The KYC sharing utility, absolutely correct.
So in the Netherlands, there was one specifically about transaction monitoring. In the Nordics, there was one on KYC, and I think the Monetary Authority of Singapore has just released one, I think it was the other week, again about KYC. So the regulators are starting to say, look, sharing information, right, is one of the only ways in which we're going to make this actually work or happen or become more effective. And there's a number of different things that we could potentially do there. There's utilities where organizations can come together, share the information. There may be technology now that will allow more available information sharing. So encryption technologies, homomorphic encryption technologies, where people can share information, share insights without necessarily, as I say, infringing any data protection regulation or legislation. So there's various different ways in which that can actually happen now. But I also think that the regulators, and they're kind of moving in this direction, and we spoke to FinCEN about this last year, is, what does good look like, right? What does a good SAR look like? A lot of banks feel that they file information to the regulatory agencies and then feedback. They don't see anything. They don't see anything. But is there a way to securely bring insights from the regulators, from the law enforcement agencies back to the financial institutions themselves in a way that, again, doesn't betray or infringe upon data protection legislation? And if that can happen, then the banks can tune their systems more effectively to detect financial crime in the future. So there's a number of different things here that I think we're trying to achieve, but it's all about breaking down the silos within an organization, silos in the external world, to make sure that we can get the right information to detect crime.
No, and what you said has so much relevance. We kind of touched on this the last time we spoke, but the lack of this kind of, we have the 314A, the 314B, but there's no 314C, where kind of banks get together, and maybe the big banks who are doing really well on compliance, they tell either other big banks or even smaller medium-sized banks, here's how I structured my compliance program. Here's how and why it passed regulatory inspection. Here's how we broke down the silos. Here's how we improved our transaction monitoring and our data capture in the KYC stage to make better SARs at the end of it. That just isn't happening right now. And maybe, maybe that should. And I understand it. Banks don't want to give away their secret sauce, but if we're all trying to get on the same page and have the highest and best programs that stop bad guys around the world, that pass muster with regulators around the world, it seems like banks should consider doing that.
Yeah, I would agree. And if you don't mind, I mean, like a couple of things just to follow up on that. One of the biggest questions we get asked by our institutions, the banks that we work for, is they say, well, what are other banks doing? Right.
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
one of the
What do the
biggest questions
regulators
that we
want?
get. Yeah.
And what are the other banks doing?
Yeah. And I think, when it comes to AML programs, right, getting them right is good for everyone, right? And a rising tide will lift all ships. And having a good AML program, you could argue it's a competitive advantage, to some organizations, but really, there's other things that give banks and financial institutions competitive advantage. Sharing AML insights, knowledge, best practice,
yes,
amongst institutions. I'm not entirely sure that's going to change, the kind of fortunes of banks, but it is going to improve dramatically our capability to detect financial crime.
What are some, so we're talking about these tenets of effectiveness. What kind of tips, and this can either be from what you've seen banks do or even from the technology side, say I'm a medium bank or a medium-sized bank or even a large bank, and I want to go from just kind of doing my AML program that passed last year, and I want to make a program that is considered more effective. I want to be kind of a truer ally of law enforcement. What are some kind of tips and tactics that they could do that? Now, I have ideas like, kind of like you said, maybe you talk to other banks in your region and you form a regional compliance sharing group. So now you're seeing more of the picture. Maybe you pick up the phone and you call your local FBI or DOJ agent or IRS CI agent and say, hey, could you talk to us about what's happening in our area? Can you guide us? Things like that. But what are some tips from your perspective?
Yeah, no, it's interesting when it comes to effectiveness. I mean, like there's a number of different things can be put into play here. I think that one of the first things is, AML can't be a tick boxing exercise, right? You can't just turn around and say, we know we have to cover all these different things. And then put controls in place to make that happen, whether or not those controls make sense, yes or no, right? Ultimately, I think all of the regulators are now saying, take a risk-based approach to your organization. So instead of just having controls for the sake of having controls, what are the priorities within your business? What do you have to do? Where are the big concentrations of risk? If something goes wrong, have you identified that as a part of a risk assessment? Have you put the right control infrastructure in place? Is it meaningful to meet that risk that you've identified, right? I think there was something in the Wolfsburg paper that says, if it's just there for the sake of it being there and you're wasting a lot of time and energy on that kind of stuff, redirect that somewhere else.
Yes.
Think about it and just reprioritize. And in fact, I was talking to one of our clients, and they said that was one of the first things that they did as part of their effectiveness program. Is
I like
just
that.
Reestablish what is the priority, what's the focus, and if it doesn't, if it doesn't meet those requirements, then redeploy the resources in the right way.
No,
I think the second.
Go ahead.
Please. No, please.
I just want to say you absolutely nailed it on that. I just want to say how important this is, because so many banks worry if they make a change that they're going to miss something over here because they're focusing something over here. And that's what I loved about that Wolfsburg paper that they pulled out and said, that's actually normal. That should show you that what you're doing is working, because the areas that are generating more productive alerts, you're focusing more on those. Whereas these areas that are getting less alerts or less effectiveness, you're kind of trimming those. And that means that you're doing well. But please go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think that all makes perfect sense to me. I think the second thing is, as I say, it's silo breaking. We've just spoken about this, right? Bring everything together, learn from one another, bring some kind of core, centralized approach to a certain degree as to how you want to manage this. The team shouldn't actually be working in silos. That there should be a communication, a dialogue that will help, identify, as I say, potential areas of risk. The third thing that I would say is that it's the technology. Again, it's the employment of the right technology to do the job. We're moving away from technology that, because of limitations, it was the only way that we could do things, right?
Right.
Very kind of rules-based approach. Very siloed. A bit clunky maybe, I'm talking about technology maybe from 10, 15 years ago. But now we've got technology that allows us to really kind of identify across swaths of information, huge swaths of information, potential anomalies, issues, that could lead to, as I say, financial crime. And, deploying those technologies in an intelligent way against the priorities and the focus that you want to mitigate can do a tremendous amount to improve the effectiveness of any AML program.
No, I love that. And I hope I can get in two last questions before we run out of time here. But, you brought out a really good point when I was talking about this. So when this all came out, this whole Anti-Money Laundering Act is focused on effectiveness. It seemed like so many banks breathed a sigh of relief. And they were like, yes, finally, I don't have to be so divided against myself. Where do I please the regulator or I do the better SAR? It seemed like those kind of priorities were coming together now. And I thought, oh, this is great. This means that banks don't have to worry about minutia. The regulators are just going to get on board, and the examiners are going to come in for that exam and be like, bank, how can I help you be more effective? I just want to get out of the way and let you be a partner of law enforcement. And like everyone just runs skipping off into the, into the sun there. It's so happy. But then when I talked to other people, of course, they laughed at me and they said, Brian, that's a very Pollyannish view. Like, no, the other kind of, potential 180 degrees away from that is the opposite happens. Things don't get easier for the banks from the regulators. They get harder. And instead of the regulator coming in and saying, you have a reasonable program, you've mitigated your risks, you filed your SARs, they can just look at everything and what they would have said last year, oh, this is good. Now the examiner can just say, yeah, this is good for last year, but I, regulator, without even talking to law enforcement, I just think you have an ineffective program. I don't think law enforcement would like this very much. And now the banks are again like, geez, what do I do here? Of those kind of two possibilities, what do you see more as playing out in reality?
I think it's a little bit of both. Ultimately, look, I know that the regulators are really trying to work collaboratively with the industry to enable everyone to improve their AML programs, right? We've seen this. FinCEN have opened up innovation sessions. Right. The FCA out of the United Kingdom have done their hackathons, which have been absolutely fantastic. We're seeing various different regulatory agencies pushing utility programs. They're saying go off and explore the new technology. It's okay. They're kind of giving exemptive relief if you want to do pilots with the regulators.
Right.
So look, at the end of the day, I think that the regulators are doing everything that they possibly can. But at the same time, the examiners and the regulators need to make sure that the banks are putting the right programs in place and that they're not accidentally or willingly circumventing certain AML obligations. So I think that the regulators will still come in, they'll still examine, there's still going to be fines. That's just part of the world, unfortunately, in which we live. I think the challenge, and we mentioned this before, in this new world of effectiveness is how do you measure effectiveness, right? Is it the number of SARs? Is it the kind of quality of the SARs?
Or SARs in a specific priority areas rather than Correct. Other areas?
Is it just the general program itself? Is it how you tie it all together? Is it how you communicate with the other institutions? What does effectiveness actually look like? And I think that as we go into next year and we see some of the actual rulemaking that happens under AMLA, I think we'll get a feel for that maybe a little bit more. The challenge that I've got is, as you saw in the Wolfsburg paper around effectiveness, is this concept of reasonably designed. It's something that I think has been, well, two words that have been in the language of the regulators for a number of different years, and this is not just in the banking world. This is across securities and also in insurance. But what does reasonably designed actually mean, right? There's a lot of leeway there in that kind of very short term. So I think that the only way in which the banks are going to know for certain is to enter into a dialogue with the regulators. I've already got banks contacting us for advice and guidance on how we're going to cover the requirements of AMLA. I
Mhm.
think that's great. We can certainly talk to them about what we're doing, but I think the dialogue with the regulators, I think, is the most key and important thing. I'm sure that the regulators are more than welcome to engage in those types of conversations.
No, I like that. And that a lot of times, people think, I don't want to show my warts to the regulators. I don't want to tell them what I don't know. But maybe in this instance, it's a good idea that you do, and you be honest with your regulator and say, look, we don't know what effectiveness looks like. The rules haven't come out yet. Can you coach us a little bit on what you want to see so we can help you, give you what you want, but also be effective with law enforcement? So last two questions, I want to pull the lens out a little bit and kind of look, across the world, across the globe, but also touch on some big pieces of news, the Pandora Papers. But, so right now, if you're a large international bank, you can't just say, oh, this is happening in the US, let me raise my program over here, but not have it raised over here. There's so many jurisdictional big changes going on. It seems like banks really have to create this kind of multi-dimensional, multi-jurisdictional, enterprise-wide financial crime compliance program that is effective, because you have what's going on in the United States with the AML. You have Canada upping a lot of their rules, focusing on gatekeepers and crypto. You have Australia that is in kind of a very adversarial review of itself from their lawmakers because they believe they've missed too much. You have the United Kingdom, facing a lot of accusations of, yeah, you have these gold-plated rules, but you're the destination for so much of the world's dirty money. As a large international bank, how can you kind of deal with all of this at once, or kind of like you were telling me before, at least kind of see these cross-cutting issues and kind of try to make some defenses for it?
Yeah, no, I think you have to obviously think global but act local to a certain extent, right? You do have to do that. And you have to be sensitive to the individual requirements for each jurisdiction and the regulatory agencies there. That said, there's a tremendous amount of crossover that I'm seeing between the various different agencies themselves, right? So under the 5th and 6th money laundering directive, say for instance, things like UBO, beneficial ownership is a key thing. Well, that's a key thing under AMLA 2020, yep. Right? We look at FATF and what FATF is kind of suggesting around some of the things around human trafficking. Well, now that's coming out as part of the AML 2020 as well. Crypto, yep. I mentioned earlier on, right? How do we regulate crypto? Some countries are just saying it's out. Some countries are saying it's in. Some countries are saying, well, you shouldn't regulate it. Some countries are saying it should. Even in the US, it feels as if it's been in, out, as to, doing the hokey cokey to a little bit as to whether or not it should be regulated. And there's some uncertainty there for sure, right? There are obviously things that you need to do from a crypto perspective, from a regulatory perspective, but should there be more? So, there's some themes, I think, that the banks and financial institutions need to consider broadly. And if they can identify those and get those right, then it's a tweak into local regulation and legislation, as opposed to having to, instill, as it were, very different programs globally.
All right, now we're about time here, so this will be my last official question. And thank you again, Stephen. I really love chatting with you because you truly have a global perspective and understand the big things and also the smaller details. The Pandora Papers. This is another massive leak from the ICIJ. This is about the 4th or 5th big leak they've had. Paradise Papers, yep. Panama Papers, the FinCEN leaks. But it seems to me that this isn't just a journalistic endeavor, but this is it's like a negative news dump that FinCrime compliance team should really look at, because it might give more nuance and more insight and context to some of their customers, so they know where to kind of devote resources. What's your take on kind of how banks should kind of deal with these massive leaks?
Well, it's very difficult, right? There's no one wants to kind of look underneath the rug and see the dirt there, right? It's always a bit of a challenge, right? But I think that they're kind of indicative of a bigger problem around shell companies, yes, beneficial ownership issues, and what have you. Look, at the end of the day, and I read quite avidly some of this stuff, and I was looking at some of the statements from some of the leaders that have been, as it were, exposed as part of this. Theoretically, they've done nothing wrong, right? There is the feeling in some instances that while they haven't broken the rules, they haven't acted in the spirit of what is required, right? But we're not regulating spirit, we're regulating rules, right? So obviously, until and if some of that stuff gets changed, then this is going to continue. But the biggest problem, I think, or one of the biggest problems that financial institutions have in identifying financial crime is the shell companies, right? It's very difficult to understand what a true company is and what a shell company is with certainty. So that's one of the things that we're looking at, obviously, to improve upon, and also to understand the beneficial ownership structure. Who owns what, and what does that actually mean? I think that these are some of the key challenges that came out of the Pandora Papers.
Well, Stephen, as usual, another amazing interview. Again, I thank you for being so gracious with your time. I learned a lot in this, and I just really appreciate it, and I really enjoy chatting with someone who is, a lot of warmth, a lot of wisdom here. So, but everyone, thank you so much for being a part of this Financial Crimecast. And hopefully we will see you again soon at a nice Actimize event or an ACFCS event coming soon. So everyone.
Thank you, Brian. Cheers.
Oh, my pleasure. So everyone, I hope you have a great day, and bye for now.